Mental hospital employees. Who's the scariest patient you've ever had to deal with? My little sister lived in a facility just like this for 8 years. I don't know that living with all those damaged children actually did her a lot of good, but the alternative would have been worse. My mother could not care for her. She was too volatile to go to school, and my mother was too busy trying to keep a roof over her head to stay home with her. Basically, our mother was simply unable to provide the special needs care she needed, so she ended up in a home where she learned a lot of bad habits. However, had she not gone home, she probably wouldn't have lived to see high school. So it was basically a choice between Lord of the Flies with extra therapy and, well, worse? I guess Lord of the Flies wins by default. Story 2. Man, there are a lot of scary cases when you work in pediatric mental health, mostly because of the age. I recently had a kiddo come in who has a history of terminating animals in the neighborhood. Some messed up crap that is definitely indicative of some serious underlying issues. The scary thing is that the parents were basically okay with this behavior, until the kid woke his parents up in the middle of the night by plunging a huge weapon into their mattress directly between them while they were sleeping. He wasn't sleepwalking and seemed perfectly aware of what he was doing. When they asked him what he was doing and why he just did that, he told them he wanted to end them. Story 3. I worked at a mental hospital for about 5 years. The scariest patient and incident involved a patient that had just had surgery to remove an object that she swallowed. I'm down the hall when I hear a nurse scream for help. Ran to the patient's room and she had opened up and was holding something in her hands. She didn't seem to feel anything though and just looked like we were interrupting her. I almost fainted from the sight. I quit that job shortly after. Story 4. I had a bump on my stomach on the left side near the belt. Doctor said it was a spider bite when I saw him when it was the size of a golf ball. It angered me because he called me a substance seeker because it hurt like hell. About 4 months later, it had reached volleyball size. During a Cat 2 hurricane, it opened up leaving a hole. Oddly, I was more concerned about the mess. Cleaned it up, crawled to a dumpster to throw the towels out, crawled back and got in the tub and passed out. I was surprised as heck that I woke up at all and my boss found me. Trees were down and there was no way to get to the hospital anyways. 4 days later, when it was clear, I just figured if I was going to end from it, I already would have. The hole closed up a few weeks later. The good thing was it got me out of chainsaw duty. Just adding that I had some really bad experiences at that hospital already, which was a major factor of why I didn't go. Story 5. I met a 5 to 6-year-old girl who was in an inpatient treatment center for trying to smother her newborn brother. She said she wanted him to end because her parents liked him too much. She would go from being a sweet, overly affectionate child to suddenly despising a person and wishing something bad on them. The hospital wanted to release her after a few days, and the parents refused to take her back that soon. The Department of Family Services ended up getting involved. Story 6. I don't work in a mental hospital, but I'm a frequent patient. I was on the ward for about 30 seconds and they were taking my vitals when an enormous bear of a human being screams, "Crap!" at the top of his lungs over and over again. He ran down the hallway and got right up in the face of a very petite medtech and was screaming. One of the patients came and stood between him and the nurse, and it really seemed like he was going to attack her. Finally, they gave him medicine and he went down. They did the same freaking thing for the next 3 nights until he actually tried hurting someone and they sent him to a more intensive unit. Story 7. My mother is a K-2 special ed teacher and had a little girl I will never forget. Her parents were very white trash looking and were in jail for trying to end each other, so she was a ward of her elderly grandparents. She had behavioral issues and would get violent sometimes. One day, her grandmother told my mom she walked in on the girl. She was almost 5, in the unlit living room squatting in the cat's kitty litter, having just had a bowel movement and now fiddling while watching the TV, which was on a channel that had that old blizzard effect you got when there was no signal. My mom had to call the state to have her put in a secure facility. By the time the state came, she had set fire to their house. I often wonder what happened to her. She'd be well into her 20s by now. Story 8. I did a 2-month internship at a very famous forensic hospital in Germany prior to my studies. Many patients there were in what we call Sicherungsverwahrung in Germany. Basically, that means when a patient is too dangerous to be ever released, he stays in the prison or hospital after his sentence time. The hospital I worked in was separated in 2 sectors. The first was for acute psychotic patients. There you had the screaming, schizophrenic, and acute dangerous people. For example, when you got stuck on a trip and ended someone, you came there. Some of the patients there were relocated relatively fast to normal psychiatric hospitals. The second one was mostly for patients who were already locked in for several years. They appeared not as obviously insane like the others, mostly because their medication was adjusted really well during the time. That's the place I worked in. We had a lot of kitty fiddlers there, but they were more pitiable, to be honest, and not really dangerous or creepy. They got medication which suppresses their libido. As a side effect, they were really sluggish and appeared kind of dumb. But there was one patient who really terrified me. In contrast to most of the others, he was really intelligent, cultivated, attractive, and extremely charming. He was some kind of accountant before he got into the psychiatric hospital. Apparently, he had a competitor at work, which he terminated and placed them in the office to show the others what happens when you get in his way. After 10 years in forensic psychiatry, he harmed his roommate at night over some minor argument. This dude really terrified me. I never met such a cold, manipulative character like him. He had this special, super creepy look on his face when he was alone with you, like he knew all your secrets and weaknesses. There was another really uneasy situation where I nearly shit my pants. Of course, it was during the night shift. Of course, our office was separated from the part of the building where the patients lived, and the only way out of the patient's area was through our office, which was highly secured with automatic locks, cameras, etc. Two of my colleagues made their round to look after the patients. I stayed in the office and watched the surveillance cameras. Suddenly, I got an unsettling feeling. I looked out of the window, and in the reflection, I saw a woman hiding behind the door, watching me, smiling. I instantly jumped out of my chair and pressed the alarm button and pager, even though the woman was one of the chilled patients. After we brought her back to her room, we tried to reconstruct how she might have got in there, but on the cameras, as we saw nothing that could have explained that. Unfortunately, it was during my last days there, so I didn't find out what happened there in the end. Story 9. I've just had screamers so far, but 2 of my colleagues have been punched by patients. No warning signs. One second they're talking normally, the next second, bam. One coworker had a broken nose. The other got a concussion and was in rehab for a year. Inpatient psych workers are basically tough as nails. Story 10. Taken from a friend of my dad's who used to work at a psychiatric hospital. One of the patients had severe schizophrenia and would just stand in silence all day, staring off into space. It was silent and had to be changed every once in a while and bathed and fed by the employees. One day, my dad's friend and the severe schizophrenic were in the cafeteria when a patient lost his crap. So my dad's friend called in the orderlies. He's standing by the wall near the emergency call-in button for these guys, next to the schizophrenic, is freaking out a little, heavy breathing, shaking a bit. And the schizophrenic, without moving a muscle, quietly says, "You were scared." The only words my dad's friend has ever heard spoken by this patient, maybe the only words he's ever really said in a very long time. Apparently, it was very unnerving. So the guy who spends his days communing with a void suddenly drops a truth bomb like he's been watching a therapy session from inside your soul. Talk about an unexpected mic drop. Story 11. I worked on psychiatric wards for about 4 years, and one of the scariest people I came across was a 17-year-old girl. Depressed, but also madly aggressive towards others and wanted to harm anything and anyone in her way. One day on the ward, a patient overheard her on the phone making an ending it all pact with her boyfriend. She asked him to bring in her pet black widow spider onto the ward when Ninex came to visit. She was going to let the spider bite and poison her boyfriend, and then let it loose on the ward. Being a massive arachnophobic, this made me scared as heck. Story 12. Knew a little girl when I was growing up in the hood. She was the illegitimate daughter of my substance user godmother, who lived upstairs in one of the locals and was born being used to substances. Subsequently, she had constant behavioral problems that my best friend was routinely saddled with while her mom went on benders. She would scream when she was only 3 years old. She would steal and hit people and break things on purpose. Her mother encouraged her to fiddle, and we were just too confused by the situation to realize that this was child mistreatment. Her mother didn't actually touch her, but if, for instance, the child was fiddling, instead of encouraging her to go somewhere private, she would just cheer her on. My girlfriend and I only saw this happen once, but it was enough for us to both nope the heck out of there for a while. Her mother smacked her around occasionally, but mostly would just scream and holler like a crazy person. She would have these epic meltdowns where she would scream and throw things. Eventually, my godmother was arrested for child endangerment and the child was placed in protective custody. I took her to CPS to file the report myself. I was 15. The point is that, turns out the child was okay. Once her mom was out of her life for a while and got clean, she actually thrived in school. Graduated earlier from a college prep high school and got a full scholarship to Harvard, where she just earned her first master's and she's only 25. Though I like to think there is hope for some of these children. Sometimes they just need a stable environment for their humanity to flourish. Story 13. I did work experience at a hospital and got put on the adolescent psychiatric ward to shadow a doctor for half a day. There was a kid who was refusing to eat who had a tube connected to him, force-feeding him, and he had a look in his eyes like he wanted to end you. It was really sad. The nurses said he just wanted to pass away and hated everyone for stopping him. Story 14. This probably will pale in comparison to others. Had an older lady who by all accounts was doing fine. Had her daily sit-down one day. She was in good spirits and was actually due to go home within the next couple days. Then something happened. Her daughter came to visit and wanted her to stay a bit longer, and apparently this triggered something. Fast forward to the next day and find her sitting on her bed having pulled out most of her hair. She looks possessed, in a somewhat catatonic state. I try to engage her in talk, but all she can say or will say or ask is, "Did I hurt you?" A little bit later, she craps all over herself. She got transferred somewhere else. Story 15. Not inpatient, but an outpatient case manager here. I've worked with a lot of people who have pretty significant histories of substance misuse, violence, erratic behavior, and a few people with convictions. For the most part, none of them fazed me too much. I've got all kinds of stories about the stuff that's happened to them, but I've only really had one client I've ever been afraid of. When he was new to the agency, I did his intake. Homeless guy, early 60s, diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was currently living on the streets and was open that he had serious issues with substance. He talked about his violent outbursts. He would get angry and paranoid and harm other homeless guys he thought were out to harm him. While talking, I then learned he had been incarcerated previously for terminating his wife. He did so, in his account, because he was depressed and the voices told him to end her. Again, none of this typically was out of the ordinary for me, but what scared me was his attitude. He described it without any prompting in a graphic but almost literate way, during which he smiled blissfully. Then, finishing saying that after that was completed, he felt relieved, like a great heavy cloud lifted from my head. It was insightful about his symptoms, but didn't seem to care. Again, this was not the first person or the first with schizophrenia that I ever worked with, but he scared the crap out of me. It was an animal instinct, if anything. After that, he was assigned to me and I never really saw him again. Last I heard, he had left for his hometown, but I still see him around occasionally, or at least I think I do. Story 16. My father is a police officer and regularly gets posted in the mental hospital, which yields some interesting experiences. This is not so much crazy as it is humorous, but this one always gets me. It was just a regular day as he's simply monitoring and being available for hospital staff towards the reception area, when a woman in hospital gowns from the end of a long hallway locks eyes and begins to make her way over to my father. Meanwhile, my father is just trying to somehow mentally prepare for the inevitable encounter he's about to have with his patient. Once said woman finally arrives where my father was standing, she looks at him with disgust and says, "Are you just going to stand there and do nothing?" Confused, he replies, "Excuse me, ma'am?" And with a loud shout, the woman exclaimed, "I have dynamite up my back and it's going to go off any second. Are you just gonna stand there?" Rightfully so, my father remains there, baffled by the encounter, and requests one of the staff members attend to the patient. Story 17. I have a patient that frequently engages in digging. Along with this digging, a part of his syndrome is an extremely high pain tolerance. During one of my shifts, I heard one of my coworkers screaming at his patient, so I, of course, ran to see what was going on. The patient was in his bed covered in red liquid. My coworker then explained to me she just caught him with his fist up right before I walked in. The nurse who was in charge told me to get him in the shower, and when he stood up, about 10 golf ball-sized fell. I was repulsed and yelled for my coworker to come back and look. The nurse then said to continue giving him a shower. My coworker and I both looked at each other and said, "Screw that," as we proceeded to call 911. I've been working at this place for 8 years and have plenty more stories like this one. I think I'm so desensitized to anything disgusting, I could probably eat a turkey sandwich with one hand and clean up with the other. Story 18. I worked on the overnight shift at this place way out in the sticks. To give some background, the idea was that if you could remove the patient from whatever caused them stress, it would help them get better, and this place used to be an old ski resort. Anyway, most nights people would be in bed by 11, so it was usually pretty, except for the off patient who couldn't sleep and would just chill and talk with us. This one guy, let's call him Mike, was pretty worse for wear and was having some trouble telling what was real and what was fake. So he comes into my office, where me and another counselor were, and tells us he thinks he saw something in the hallway. All three of us go into the hall to show him that everything is okay when a mass of air comes out of a room, floats around for a couple seconds, and goes back in. Needless to say, we all freaked out and ran back to the office. Immediately following it, I ran back to the room it entered to try and catch it. There were no other patients in the room at all. I don't know what I saw, but the place had a history and it shook us all up. Story 19. My dad did carpentry work at a hospital before trading in the hammer for a suit and tie and taking over as director of facilities. He has some crazy stories about the people he had to deal with in the psych ward. This extremely violent patient kept smashing this window, so my dad kept having to go back and fix it. My dad is a man's man and doesn't scare easily, but is also really nice and laid back and knows how to avoid confrontation. So the guards always used to laugh when a violent patient would talk crap to him, and my dad would just let it roll off his back. Patient. "Look, you white guy, don't even bother fixing that window. I'm gonna just smash that crap again." Dad stops what he's doing. "Look, buddy, I'm here in overtime, which means the longer you keep me here, the more money goes in my pocket. So let me get this fixed. And as soon as I'm done, you can do whatever the heck you want to this thing." Patient, scowling. "Fair enough, but I'm still gonna bust it." Dad. "Hey man, that's cool. Like I said, do what you want. I'm still getting paid, you know? I'm not 100% sure what happened next. The patient said something nasty to my dad or threatened him or something, and the guards then yelled at him. Guard, after he leaves, it's just you and me here tonight. So shut the heck up and let him do his job. Patient, night. Sorry. Dad, yeah, man, no problem. Story 20. I was a patient in a mental hospital once. The vast majority of mental patients are not scary, and it's easy to forget that and stigmatize mental illness. The scariest person I saw there was a man who was upset because he didn't understand his medication. I stayed on the other side of the common room until he stopped and started yelling at an orderly. And even then, he wasn't violent. He got an injection in his back and he was fine the next day. Second scariest was a nurse who criticized this toothless Polish dude for not speaking English well. I avoided her too. One guy would hide his pills under his tongue so the nurse thought he swallowed them and then stashed them in his room and used them to get spiked. There was a really smart dude, a teacher. He talked for hours about spirituality and education. All the guys in for ending it all attempts were super chill. I met someone who gave me weightlifting tips. Hope he gets clean. Actually, I just thought of a scarier patient. Great guy, lots of fun, completely psychotic. Could barely answer simple questions. He just paced around with a goofy smile on his face, talking to himself. My favorite was when he'd jump on a table and pretend he was on stage. He'd hold an imaginary mic and rap until the orderlies got him down. He was a straight-A student until he took a bad batch of substance and screwed his brain. He'd been at the facility for 18 months. What makes his story the most unsettling was the one lucid moment he had while I was there. He stopped pacing, went silent, then mumbled, "I'm stupid," and louder, "I'm stupid," and shouting, "End me, I'm stupid." That was freaking scary in an existential way, because 5 minutes later he was back to a goofy grin and pretending to be a rapper. Story 21. We had a guy that would constantly shove things down and, I mean anything, to the point where he can't even have paper in his room or he would roll it up and jam it in there too. There's a million other things, but I don't want to go into detail to not breach confidentiality. He's pretty memorable. If you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 22. Not a mental hospital, but a caregiving center for seniors, most of whom had mental problems. There was one patient who would mumble numbers to himself, but one day he trailed off talking. He then looked up in a dreamlike state and pointed to an empty chair not far from where he was. He said, "She used to sit there," and then went right back to mumbling numbers. Just an average Tuesday. He's probably just trying to remember his bingo numbers, but then got sidetracked by a special bingo partner. Classic Tuesday. Story 23. In the 90s, I worked overnight and weekend security at a center for psychiatry that cared for inpatients, outpatients, and even criminally insane awaiting trial. The area of the building was basically a prison. People would often bring in the arrested for evaluation, and the homeless could even walk in and ask for help. We saw all kinds. I did this job for years, and some nights got very, very busy. Two scary situations really stick out from those times. The first, I was manning the front desk, and a walk-in patient holding a weapon walked in, screaming, "I want to end myself." He had wounded himself all over his body. My supervisor quickly rifled through the database and found him. History of violence against staff, AIDS, hepatitis, and more. I was commanded to put him down. I approached him with a chair as a shield. When he wound up swinging the weapon at me, I rammed him with a chair until he went down. Then a bunch of staff jumped in and everybody put one foot on him until he was better subdued and eventually sedated. A doctor was in my face right afterwards yelling, "Did he touch you? Did he cut you?" I wasn't sure until after an examination. The second incident started when two police officers brought in a tough-looking guy for assessment. This guy's keeping his head down, not saying anything. I lead them to a secure observation room. They're arrested and one officer goes in. The other cop returns with me to get our information and to see if he's in our database. Suddenly, my partner, who was watching the monitors jump up, hits the alarm and runs back the way we came. We run after, the doors open, and we see the guy wailing on the officer with his handcuffs like a one-handed flail. The other cop does most of the work in this case, and the arrest is pretty much laid out on the floor. How did this happen? How the heck did this happen? In my quick inspection, I noticed that his hands are funny. They're all covered in red liquid from the fight, but something isn't right. I look closer. This guy doesn't even have a thumb. The cop looks at the other hand. Holy crap. They cuffed this guy and didn't notice he was missing both thumbs. The cuffs would just slide off. I still think about that guy. How? Why? For what reason? What crazy world was he a part of where something like that could happen? I still wonder. Story 24. I was in the general psychiatric unit. One night I suddenly woke up, which was completely unusual because my night meds knocked me out beautifully, and realized there was somebody kind of hovering over me. But it wasn't my roommate or a nurse. As they pulled at my blanket, started yelling, and he grabbed something from my bedside table and ran out of the room. I went to grab my glasses to chase after him and realized they weren't my glasses, but some other patient's. The guy had grabbed my glasses by mistake and left his. I ran into his room and grabbed my glasses back, and he was stammering about how he's been sleepwalking and went to the wrong room by mistake, etc. But that was absolute BS, and I was already on my way to the nurse's station to get them to deal with it all. I went immediately back to sleep, but the next morning a nurse came to wake me up and check in with me, and the freaking creepy guy came over and tried to interrupt to apologize. Started screaming at him again. Nowhere more appropriate to yell passionately than on the psych ward, to be honest, and the nurses were on him immediately. They absolutely demanded he not stay on that ward, and they did put him on the more intense one. They'd been creeping a lot on the younger women, including me, on the ward over the few days he'd been there, and I refused to believe he wasn't straight up trying to get him in bed. He told the other patients they were moving him off the ward because I made up these horrible lies about him trying to get him in bed, and that I wasn't even attractive anyways. But everyone else in the ward was an actual good egg, and when I sat down at breakfast and told them what had happened, they were like, "Oh yes, it all sounds terrible and true, and he seems exactly like the kind of guy who would do that." I regret not punching him, and I regret not making a bigger deal about it within the hospital institution. But this was my first psych stay, and I was a newbie. Story 25. I worked at a group home for psychiatric adolescents for 6 years right out of college. I witnessed some pretty disturbing behavior during my time there, to say the least. The incident which easily takes the cake was a 17 or so year old female resident with a history of AWOL, running away. She always came back or was brought back by the PD after a few hours or sometimes days. That is, until the last time when she took off running down the road. Turns out she linked up with some friends, sharing an apartment, and ended up partying, etc. A few days later, an argument broke out and she threatened to accuse one of the men who lived in the apartment of mistreatment, also one of her MOs, so they all ended her. Fortunately, one of the roommates eventually reported the crime and she was found and they were arrested. So heartbreaking and tragic, yet is not an uncommon end to these kids who get institutionalized from a young age. Story 26. Didn't work at one, but was a patient in a psych ward for a bit. I had two friends there. Let's call them John and Eric. John was perfectly fine, just a little depressed, and his family was worried about him, so they sent him to a psych ward. Probably not the best method. Maybe try therapy first. I assumed Eric was the same. He seemed to have a loving family that visited when they were allowed. Until one day we were playing some Wii bowling and Eric turned towards John and I mid-game. He says he's been having bad dreams. Immediately I say, "Oh, Dr. So-and-so has a pill for that." It helped me. This psych ward, like a lot, over-medicated out but I thought it was normal to get a pill for every little problem. Eric turns to me and says, "I've seen you pass away every night since I got here. I can't wait to see it again." The second he reached for the craft scissors on the table, mistakenly left out for whatever reason, John knocked him down and I ran to get help. Heard he ended himself about 6 months ago and I went to visit his grave because I didn't believe it. Story 27. I'm a psychology student. This is a story from one of my most favorite abnormal psych professors. And while it might not be scary in a gross or frightening way, it is scary that stuff like this happens to people. My professor was working with a patient doing some job counseling. We'll call the patient Julie. Julie is a 23-year-old woman who lives with her mother, stepfather, and her 5 children. She's having trouble keeping a job as she was recently fired from her job at a call center for falling asleep on the job and for lashing out and hitting her manager in the face. She's been fired from 8 out of 12 jobs. She's studying to become a CNA and has had multiple warnings for falling asleep in class. 4 out of 5 of her children are in the custody of her mother due to a personal and familial history of substance misuse, trafficking, and check fraud. Julie has her own probation officer, and 2 of her children have probation officers for fighting at school. One almost ended another kid. There is constant fighting in the home between Julie and her mother, but they do not argue when the stepfather is around. Julie's mother denies any cruelty occurred when Julie was a child, but Julie remembers otherwise. Came out later in therapy that Julie was never taught how to tell time. The reason she was so tired was because she was staying up all night watching television so that the correct television time slot would prompt her to wake her kids up for school and for her to get to work. In addition, my professor found out later that all 5 of Julie's children were born from a relationship with her stepfather. She was also staying up all night to protect her children from the stepfather. Good news. Julie got the right diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. She continued therapy in school and got back custody of all 5 of her children. She is happily married now to a woman and is an artist. So no, it's not the scariest story out there, but I will never forget it. We had several other cases to analyze during that class, but this one about Julie will stay with me forever. I can't get over the fact that no one ever taught her to tell time. Story 28. I was a patient in an adolescent psych ward. There was this one person with schizophrenia and she just went crazy, throwing chairs and stuff. Then she got near the nurse station and jumped on that breaking things and yelling really loudly. Lasted about 15 to 20 minutes and there was a lot of damage. Patient was transferred to another psych hospital and I thought I would never see her again. Then I got out and went to the same one she was in. She was standing in front of the girls' beds as they slept and giving them creepy notes. Don't know what happened to her. Story 29. I was in an inpatient pediatric unit for a brief period of time when I was about 10. There was a little girl there about 5 who had basically been her parents' toy her entire life. She had been removed from multiple foster homes because she kept mistreating the other kids. She was a sweet kid, but you couldn't play with her at all because she always wanted to play house, which involved simulating acts. Everything in this poor kid's life revolved around intimacy. And whenever she was disciplined, she would try to have intimacy with staff members to try and make up. It was creepy when I was a kid, but as an adult, it's even more horrifying to think that this poor little girl was basically brainwashed by some sick adults. I have no idea what happened to her, but I really hope she found some peace in life and that her parents passed away in an oil rig fire, begging for their lives to an uncaring God. Story 30. Worked in a facility in New York State that housed offenders. One of them was someone who ended people. He was in his 50s, older and gray-haired and not particularly large. He rarely, if ever, spoke to others. Occasionally other inmates, seeing how quiet he was, would try to intimidate or pester him. This small, mild man would get a creepy look in his face and his eyes would darken. His jaw would clench and he'd start to breathe hard and then just as suddenly it would pass. He'd look at the other person and say, "I could just end you." Wouldn't yell or even raise his voice. Then he'd walk off. I saw him do that twice. And I have no doubt the face I saw for just a second was the one his victim saw right before he ended them. It was some scary crap. Scared me, and both times scared the other inmates he spoke to. He didn't say it was a threat. It was more a statement of fact. The words of a man who could and had ended others before, with little difficulty and no remorse. In person, that's some creepy crap. Story 31. So I am currently working in an inpatient psychiatric hospital to get experience for grad school, and the setting I work in is specifically for patients who need stabilization, e.g. off their meds or need to get back on them, or in a crisis. I've worked on almost every unit in the hospital, so maybe a month ago, I was doing a night shift in the schizophrenia unit. The staff told me about a particular patient in one of the wings that, 1, does not sleep at night, and 2, has been attacking male staff. I am a 5'6", 140-pound male, not very intimidating. So I get out onto the unit. This patient comes out. He's probably like 5'8", 160 pounds, burly guy. Definitely could take me down if he wanted to. And I introduced myself to him, etc. Now, anytime this patient would talk to you, he would whisper, so it was very hard to hear him, but naturally he would get upset the more times you asked him to repeat himself, and it showed in his face. So at one point he poked his head out of his door while I'm doing my observation rounds and whispers something to me while gesturing for me to come to his room. So I'm standing at the threshold of his doorway and he asks me to come into his room. I was extremely hesitant, obviously, because I wasn't trying to get hit, so this patient noticed that and clear as day, no whispering, said, "Come on, man, I ain't gonna hit you." I almost crapped my pants when he said that, but against my instincts, I went into his room anyway because he might actually need help with something. Then he starts closing the door and in my head I'm just like, crap. Turns out all he wanted was to show me this picture behind his door. It was a picture of this very cute baby in a flower costume that he seemed to get a kick out of. That was a long night. Story 32. I found borderline patients to be pretty freaking trippy. One girl loved to eat anything off the ground. Pika, batteries, pens, staples, twigs, you name it. They had to operate on her to take all that crap out, and once that was done, got so bad they had to put wrist restraints and these pillow mends on both her hands with a 2-to-1 supervision watch. Attention-seeking, very manipulative, and malingering at 18 years old. Story 33. Not a mental hospital, but a group home for psychologically disturbed teens. Had one girl come from the hospital heavily medicated due to very violent behaviors. Usually had slow movement and response, slack-jawed, eyes half shut and spaced out. The other girls picked on her a lot because of it. One of the staff had told her once that she should stand up for herself. She turned slowly to the staff and said, "Miss, those girls don't deserve what I can do to them." Story 34. The scary cases aren't usually the violent ones. Honestly, if a patient is going to become violent, you know it. The vast majority of violent patients I have had attacked objects or threw things, and rarely directly attacked people. I can count on one hand patients who have attacked or hurt a staff member, for one of their peers, on a single hand after a decade doing this. The scary cases are the legitimately insane ones who have done things they believe 100%, even after weeks or months on medicine to have been totally normal or even good. Like the person who mistreated their child because they thought their spouse had been. They were checking the child for physical evidence and ended up creating the evidence. Totally 100% thought they were doing the right thing. 2 months with us. A year plus in a long-term facility. Was arrested after that. Eventually sent to a forensic hospital until they stopped being crazy, which will never be. Has appealed a couple of times. There was a year or so where they were sending us or our psychiatrist nasty accusing letters. Another case was a person who was convinced they had to end a specific person. Again, about 2 or so months with us, no improvement, no shaking them from their delusional belief. As far as I know, they're still in stay care. Then the one who burnt down their house to end their delusional monsters. Audio hallucinations. Their family escaped in time and no one was hurt. This person is out of the community. I see them occasionally, will spontaneously try to convince others they had cured their mental illness by burning down the house and only has good voices now. Story 35. I had another patient who had a schizophrenic breakthrough in college and was super religiously preoccupied, i.e. obsessed with having only kosher foods, talking about how she was one of the only Black Orthodox Jews. She would play with her red liquid as a ritual and make art with it on construction paper and hand them out to other patients and wipe it on their room door. Before she was admitted, she was fiddling with weapons. She also lived in college housing and had roommates, where she would smear stuff on their community door. One day, she got mad and broke a glass mug into pieces, put the broken pieces in cake batter and baked cupcakes, then served them to everyone she was living with, and then some. Story 36. I work in a mixed gender ward. Not long ago, a tall but very lean male client picked up a 30-plus kg metal table, lifted it above his head, and went to throw it at a female client, who called him the N-word. I'm a cleaner, not allowed to interact with clients above a "Good morning, can I please clean your room?" This was going to be serious. No nurses on hand. I just walked into the ward to find this. Shrieked the client's name along with the loudest "No!" I've ever managed. He split-second changed his mind and threw it through the protective glass in front of the TV entertainment systems. Picked it up again, and this time it went through a window. The third time was through a wall. The sheer strength this young man had was beyond belief. It takes 2 of us to shift this piece of furniture when we shampoo the carpets. All this happened in under half a minute. I grabbed the girl. Luckily, I didn't get fired for this and yank her out of the way. Nurses flood in. Chaos ensues. Very rarely do things get this out of hand. It's the speed that circumstances change that is truly terrifying. Story 37. A dude self-harmed to the point of almost passing away. That was a tough day. It was also that he could get transferred to A&E or he could get opium medication for the pain. Another patient threw boiling water mixed with sugar over the face of another patient because he was gay. That went to court, as he had full capacity and it was a hate crime. He got a significant sentence for it. Story 38. I worked security at a 72-hour holding facility for 5150s. One guy that sticks out for just being disgusting. He couldn't stop scratching his head. And he keeps scratching away while staring us straight in the eyes. Scariest moment would be a woman that almost bit a chunk while strapping her into this restraint chair, but a nurse grabbed her by the hair at the last second and slammed it back into the chair. Thank you again, nurse. Story 39. I was a patient in an adolescent psych ward for about 2 weeks when I made the unfortunate mistake of talking about my belief in atheism with my roommate who also shared my belief. Little did we know, the violent schizophrenic who often told people that he was God was sitting behind us and didn't like what we were saying. When me and my roommate went to bed, we heard our bathroom door open and the schizophrenic ran out of the bathroom, grabbed my roommate and asked her, "Do you repent? If you repent, I promise to make it swift." The dude had 2 broken plastic forks that he sharpened somehow and started to press them against my roommates until it finally screamed and caught the attention of a nurse who subdued him and got him dragged out. My roommate thankfully only had a tiny scratch on her face, but what we found out later, it chilled us. I found out the reason he was in the psych ward in the first place was he harmed the girl he was stalking at the time because she insulted him when he showed up. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're gonna love this. Catch you in that video.